Film Club.
Thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Film Club. I'm one of your hosts, Andy Harrison. With me, as always, it's Andy Donaldson.
No.
Andy, every week in Film Club, we invite good people at home along to watch film with us. This week, our film comes recommended by N to the power of N, and he brings us Sorcerer.
So Sorcerer is a film about a group of people who don't really make it in their current lives. They get forced away, they have to run away, and they go to a country that don't quite know at the start, but then later on I find out it's is it Puerto Rico? Am I right there? Anyway,
they're in South America. I can't remember if it's actually said where.
So South America, yeah, good call. So we've got South America, and then they get an opportunity to get a good bit of dollar, but at the risk of their own lives.
Now, this is directed by William Friedkin, who I believe the only other William Friedkin film we've done on the channel so far was The Exorcist, which obviously you and I both absolutely just gushed over when we were talking about that.
I came in really excited, and the premise as well. I was like, oh, get in.
And for Sorcerer, it's actually a remake of a 50s film, 50s French film, I believe, called The Wages of Fear.
Supposedly, he doesn't like to think it as one, does he, or something like that? Friedkin. He says, "Oh no, it's not a sequel,
which is
a remake." Sorry,
strange because it is. Like, I get that there are significant differences between the two, but in terms of narrative structure and even character work, it's a remake. And Sorcerer comes, I believe, 4 years after William Friedkin has made The Exorcist. The Exorcist was
this is after.
This is after, yeah.
No way.
So The Exorcist was a huge success. He's riding quite high. And I think he actually wanted to make a different film at first, and he thought in the interstitial between that, he would just make a smaller film, which would be Sorcerer, which ironically would kind of balloon and grow, and the scope of it would kind of like stretch, and it would become this huge project for him. Now, Sorcerer at the time marks a really interesting moment in cinema. Do you know what Sorcerer released back-to-back against?
Star Wars.
Yeah. Now,
so is that a shift in the interests of the audience?
What it does is that in 77, well, I guess in 75, really, because Star Wars often gets paired up with Jaws in terms of bringing in the age of the blockbuster.
Yeah.
Now, what the blockbuster does is it makes very digestible, accessible films to a wide audience. It makes films which are mass marketed. It makes films which can be enjoyed by people on multiple levels, especially the early blockbusters. There's some decent depth there. But what it also marks the beginning of is the turn away from the auteur director. Sort of like pre-1975, 1977, film studios are much more engaged with how much is this thing going to cost us and how can we recoup that cost. And then from the birth of the blockbuster, the film studios slowly become more and more involved in the process, and things start to get a little bit more difficult because it's no longer about film, it's now about merchandising, and suddenly the amount of money that's involved goes up exponentially. So Sorcerer comes out in 1977 against Star Wars, and it becomes this representative moment in the cinematic history where cinema is no longer, or at least cinematic audiences are no longer being taken by the auteur directors. Instead, what they're going towards is something which harkens back to a more simple era in cinema, Star Wars being sort of like a dressed up version of a classic Western story. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously Sorcerer comes out in 77 and flops.
Yeah, financially.
Absolutely.
And critically, apparently, as well.
With all that nonsensical history out of the way, what do you think?
I enjoyed it. I wouldn't say I loved it, but I wouldn't say I dislike it. It took a while to kick in at the start. I know he's got like the kind of backstory of each person's life. It was slow, but once it starts kicking off when they're over there and have that journey, I felt like I was watching a heavily dramatized version and very thrilling version of almost, it's going to sound like and I don't mean any offense in this comparison, but you have these Top Gear do these kind of day out trips. No, but hear me out. And they did one where they go through the jungle, and you got to use I know it's a bit different then, but you got to use the resources available to get through the jungle. Obviously, there's a lot more on the line, comparing it like a fictionalized kind of day trip or whatever Top Gear do to this gripping film.
This film feels visceral. The film feels very tactile. The scenes in which they are slowly crawling across those bridges, and you can hear the wood creak and break,
God, yeah.
and you can feel the weight of the truck as the engine sort of like grinds and pushes it over a couple of like a mound, or you can feel the rain sloshing down on the characters, and everything about it makes you tense. And there's a couple of moments in the film that do it, but the big one that everyone always remembers, and the one that's kind of featured on the poster, is the one where they're crawling across the bridge, and you do it twice because you do it with both
down.
trucks. And I think the whole thing, doesn't it last like 12 minutes?
I honestly, I was at that point, I was so engrossed in the film. I was like, "This is incredible."
It has
That was
you
the
just,
and he
like
falls down the hole, and he's trying. The truck's behind him. He's going. It reminds me of, I can't remember what the film, but World War film where he's crawling away from a tank.
Gorgeous.
It's amazing.
And that moment there in particular really struck me, because when he falls in that hole, the best thing that Friedkin does is he just cuts the audio. As he plummets into the water, we also lose the whole audio track because we're going with him. It's such a small thing, such momentary thing, but it does what I think it demonstrates what this film does best, and that is it's tense and it is plot driven, but it's plot driven with characters that you care about at the center of it, not on an emotional level, but more like in an intriguing level. And it's because he spent the first 30-40 minutes of the film meticulously setting up their backstories. This film is kind of the inverse in lots of ways of a typical narrative, whereas a typical narrative will start with a character and then like the scope of it becomes wider from there. What Sorcerer does is it starts with this large scope and then sort of narrows it down until you're dealing with something that's very simple, which is just the transferring of this object, this MacGuffin, this dynamite that has to move from A to B.
The audio is sublime. And upon reading about it a bit more, I found out that like one of my favourite things about the audio was just the purring sound of the engines, but it's like this aggressive nature that you've got to like calm this beast. It turns out that the audio was the only thing that was about this film was nominated for an Academy Award. It was a combination of wild cat sounds like jaguar or cheetah or something like that.
That's awesome.
And I was, well, it is though, because it truly represents. I mean, we're talking like weirdly, coincidentally, the same year that Star Wars came out, and the amount of like make the lightsabers and all that, the combination of sounds that are used in that sound team. I mean, that they rightfully deserve to win because it's fucking next level Star Wars. But the fact of the matter is, they're still employing those similar techniques here, and just that creativity. So behind that, absolutely behind it. What better example is towards the end when the car, obviously the engine gets shot, and it's like running away, and you can hear this like thing hanging on for its last bit of life. I was just like, oh my God.
We can't skip over the fact that the soundtrack is handled by Tangerine Dream.
And the music's incredible.
As Tangerine Dream would go on to be quite influential, but here, I was struck by how it felt a little John Carpenter. And obviously, this is backwards, because really, this came years before John Carpenter would have his sort of influence. So it's interesting to see where John Carpenter was pulling some of his inspiration from.
What I really liked about the music and the kind of music and drones and everything, it was how industrial it sounded. Just like the kind of clashing, the metallic kind of sounds, it absolutely killed it. And to be fair, the performances were class as well. We can't even deny that.
Especially Roy Scheider. And what is the guy who plays the French character called?
So it's Bruno Kremer.
Yeah. Bruno Kremer
plays Victor Manson. And I love that. I love him where he's waking up to his wife. Obviously, he's like, she's like making that novel and like have that relationship. Then he goes into the start of the film. He goes into the guy he's talking to, and he's on about like fraud and all this kind of stuff. And he has this lovely kind of confidence persona. And then when he's over there, and he's like obviously runs away, and he's like, he's that kind of confidence kind of leaves him. I was a bit gutted when his death came about, because it was right in their prime. He was like missing home, and then suddenly that happens. And it was a bit like, oh God, I'm really starting to dig this character. You go from as you mentioned there, you're enjoying these characters out of interest, but suddenly it's that, there's a bit of emotional connection, at least in that moment there was, and then suddenly like that, it's gone.
The thing is, it's wonderfully subversive. Like the film is kind of through and through quite nihilistic in the way it handles its characters. They are forced to leave their homes because of X, Y, or Z. But then the point at which they start to work back towards returning to those lives and they start to hopefully have semblance of character again. The
Yeah.
moment at which he finally opens up when we get a character moment is the moment at which he's killed. And it kind of goes on to do that as well. Like, I think the reason that Roy Scheider's character kind of succeeds and gets to the end is that he's the one that remains quite closed off throughout the entire thing, in that sort of like nihilistic way of this film is about fate and the fact that you kind of cannot escape that fate. And even at the end, when he for a moment, I guess, is allowed a little bit of reprieve, and he's allowed to step away from this gripping tension you've had for the last hour. That breath that he takes becomes his death.
Really well played.
I loved it. I had an absolutely great time with this. I was blown away by it. I thought it was a fantastic film. But anyway, there is Sorcerer. You can let us know in the comments below what you thought of Sorcerer, or you can hit us up on Twitter, as always. Thank you again to End the Power of End for recommending Sorcerer, because this was an absolute blast this week. And
yeah, good call.
Andy and I will be back once again next week, where we're going to take a look at another Friedkin film with the French connection.
Oh, interesting. Get in.
So until then, get watching.
Bye.